So I think we only had one pair of vestments in this rose color this morning. So I think Father Tom or Deacon John are in rebellion. But, this color, of course, is similar to the Gaudete Sunday during the Advent season. It's meant, this is a Sunday where we're meant to, just to sort of raise our heads a bit and to see that, and perhaps that's a little easier with the sun shining outside, and, we're getting these little emanations of spring. We have beautiful blooms. I think you'll agree with me. The blooms are coming out on the oriental fruit trees, and also the plants. So we begin to see, that in fact new life is on its way, right? That's what we celebrate, this new season that we will come to celebrate in large fashion and in an ongoing manner in our Easter season. This gospel passage, I don't know about you, but I was made to memorize this passage when I was a little boy. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that everyone who believed in him might not perish but might have eternal life. That's kind of, in some sense, at the bedrock of our whole faith, isn't it? That Jesus was sent not to condemn the world, but to save the world. And that, in fact, in this great enterprise of salvation, you and I are the beneficiaries. And so it's with that in mind, perhaps, that we might take a look at the other mention here in the gospel passage, the talk. Jesus was speaking to Nicodemus, of course. And he says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. You recall this bizarre story in the Old Testament where the people had drifted away from the Lord, gathering a sense of that from our first reading today. And you'll recall that there were serpents that were sent into the camp, the Israelite camp, right? And they began to bite people, and they died. It was this terrible affliction. And it was only, so these serpents running it, and then God instructs Moses to build a bronze serpent, right? And then he was to hold that up, and that whoever looked upon this sign was saved. Now, I don't know about you, but this strikes me as altogether strange. What a strange thing. You think about the serpent in the first place. The serpent is a symbol of the ancient enemy, the deceiver, the tempter in the garden. It harkens all the way back. And in fact, the way that God comes to us throughout in the course of salvation history, he's always, many times where he's hearkening all the way back to the beginning, right? That this initial fall from grace that had precipitous and calamitous effects, right? It interrupted man's relationship with nature, so that nature is antagonistic now, an antagonistic relationship with man. You think about earthquakes and tsunamis and hurricanes and tornadoes. All of that is on the level of being, right? That this is a disruption between the proper relationship that man's supposed to have over nature, which is one of dominion, right? Helping things flourish and be what they are, as opposed to domination, which is the other side of that relationship. It's not just nature and its violence towards us. It's also man's bad relationship with nature, that we tend to grasp from the world, exploiting the world, taking more from it than it can rightly give. That's not the only effect of the fall. There's an alienation between you and me, right? That very often I misunderstand you, understand what your needs are. I become presumptuous even. That we misunderstand each other, right? That this creates this space that opens up in between us. In its worst case scenario, what this looks like is the story of human history, right? That shows us the clash of kings and kingdoms, emperors and empires, right? It's a bloody register, isn't it? the story of human history. I mean, this is kind of a cynical way to look at it, but it's still nonetheless a very real thing to see this brokenness that is within the human family itself. So the estrangement between each other. This is also true between men and women, right? We hear that there's an estrangement between men and women that occurs. I mean, the frustrating realization, the man comes in after a long day at work. Mom has been at home taking care of the children, however many children she might have. I realize this story is not universal, right? There are always exceptions to this. I just mean to say, he comes in and all he wants to do is sit down, and she is upset, and his reaction to that is, how in the world could she be upset? Or what is happening, right? There's this strange lack of connection, a lack of integrated knowledge about what's going on. And the way this manifests is a kind of estrangement, right? And it takes all sorts of terrible forms. But at the end of the day, the man is better being with the woman and the woman with the man. And yet there's this constant tension that is there in this relationship. This is all the way, this is like designated as a specific thing, right? A consequence of the fall. And then there's the moral struggle inside all of us. I just don't do what I want to do, what I know I should do, right? I put off today what I should do tomorrow. I put off till tomorrow what I should do today, better said, right? This is the reality, that we come into the confessional, we're confessing the same sins over and over again, right? And that can be discouraging, can it? Right? This feeling, this sort of going uphill. But this is, as it were, the battleground where we all live and we all breathe. And it's in this context then that we take our stand against the enemy, right? Going back to this idea of the serpent representing, right, this ancient enemy. Why in the world would it be that symbol that is the symbol of salvation? Perhaps we have to look at the cross, right? This is what Jesus does here. He says, just as the serpent was lifted up to death, so the Son of Man must be lifted up on a tree, right? And now that becomes the symbol of salvation. To think about the cross for 1 second. The cross is definitively the worst thing that's ever happened in human history. There's no question about that. God himself sent his only Son to humanity, right? To reconcile each other, to reconcile himself to the rest of us, to heal the brokenness in our relationships, to put right the world. You think about what Jesus did in the context of he stood before the storm and said, be silent, and it was silent, right? A manifestation, let's say, of original dominion, what it was, not to dominate creation, but to have a kind of authority over creation, right? Jesus is doing this all the time, and he's upending, right, this brokenness that characterizes humanity's relationship with creation. He is showing us what it is to be an authentic Adam, right? An authentic Adam that now is putting right the things that before were forsaken and forfeit because of the failure, the fall of our original parents. Now, Jesus himself, as the new Adam, is putting things right. But the cross is a sign of contradiction. We hear that. Simeon said, tells Mary and Joseph that when Jesus was being consecrated in the temple, says that this son of yours will be a sign of contradiction, right? That he's going to be the cause of the rise and the fall of many, right, throughout history. But we have to see that the crucifixion is the worst thing possible, like the worst ending to this story in some ways. Of course, it wasn't an ending, but it seemed like an ending, even to those that were witness to it. That he was nailed to the cross, put to death by the very people he comes to save. Right? This is a terrible event. And as St. Paul goes on to characterize it very surprisingly. He goes on to say about this cross that it is the glory of God manifest. the love of the Father put forward. That in fact, this is a sign of triumph, not failure, he says. Because what it does is it manifests the extent of the love of God's love, the extent of the Lord's love for us and for creation. Right? This is an extraordinary moment. But the sign that you have to see that this cross is an indictment against the human family. Right? It was our failure that led to this. He was betrayed by one in his inner circle. I often think about that. I mean, look, if Judas, who walked and talked with Jesus, saw what he had done, the great signs and wonders, if he could betray Jesus, it's a pretty good bet that we can too, right? Just to bear that in mind. It's important in the moral walk, the moral life, getting ourselves square with the Lord and being honest that we are capable of all kinds of terrible things. This shouldn't be a huge emphasis, but we have to recognize the fact that sinfulness, a beautiful reflection on this by Father Mike Schmitz recently, where he talks about this thing in his chest, right? He talks about his heart. He's talking about his heart. That if the disciples could abandon Jesus, right, and betray him, so can I, right? Just to be aware of that. That in our hearts is a broken instrument in need of redemption. And in our core is this capacity to fall, right? To fall far from the Lord. People get in the position where they feel like they can't be forgiven. I mean, deep down in the bottom of their hearts, right, in their deepest parts of their spirit, they think to themselves, I can't be forgiven for that. I just can't be forgiven. Right? And it's sort of like this guilt continues to bang them over the head. So much so that they stop feeling the effects of that guilt, which is like the pinch. It's like the conviction, right, that spurs us forward and keeps us. No, you can be forgiven for that, right? That's number one. Number two, no matter how bad it is, you can be forgiven for it. Just to remember that. But in this moment, though, we look at the cross and we have to realize that it is a sign of something really bad on the one hand, and yet on the other hand is a symbol of the extent of God's love for us. That in fact, the Lord God, the Father above, loves the world. You know, we talk about the sacraments, and sacraments are always visible signs of invisible grace, right, instituted by Jesus to convey his divine life. That's the shotgun answer. If you ever had to define it in the abstract, that's what a sacrament is. A visible sign of invisible grace instituted by Christ to convey his divine life. There are little different iterations on that, but that's the basics, right? If you're going to read the Baltimore Catechism, I almost like the Baltimore Catechism because it gave us basic answers, right, to some of the deepest questions, like the purpose of life, right, is to know, love, and serve the Lord in this life and be happy with him in the next, right? Shotgun answer. Not very satisfying, but at least you knew that. If someone came and asked one of your little kids, what's the meaning of life, right? At least they have something to say in response to that. But that you think about the sacraments all are, so, in the case of the Eucharist, it's bread and wine, right? It's the visible sign, right? Becoming the body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus, who communes with us. You think about reconciliation, it's the words and gestures, right? The confession of the penitent. You think about baptism, right? Which we're about to celebrate the entrance of individuals who have been preparing to come into the church as catechumens. We're going to baptize them. The visible sign is water, and in fact, the flowing of the water, right, over the forehead. Visible signs. These are all ordinary things, aren't they? Water, oil, bread, and wine. Ordinary things. But we say of Jesus that he is the sacrament. What in the world do we mean by that? What is he the sacrament of? Right? All of the sacraments have, behind them this work, whether it's a healing, whether it's strengthening. In the case of baptism, it's both healing, forgiveness, and elevation. So coming now into participating into God's divine life. What is Jesus the visible sign of? if he is the sacrament of sacraments, the sacrament upon which all the rest is built, I'm going to suggest to you that he is the sacrament, the visible sign in creation of the Father's love for us. That's what he is. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father, he says to it. Show us the Father and we'll be satisfied, he says, right? Have you been with me this whole time and you still do not understand? If you see me, you have seen the Father. I am the visible sign. To look at Jesus was to see something, first foot forward, ordinary. This was so much the case that he got kicked out of his hometown. Isn't this Jesus, the carpenter's son, the son of Mary? Do we not know his brothers and sisters? Right? To see Jesus was to see something ordinary. Like, who's this guy to talk like this? Isn't this JC from down the road? Right? You know, I mean, that's where we were, guys. I mean, that's the case. Right? To see Jesus is to see something ordinary, except for not so much. He was the eternal Logos, the Son of God, the cosmic Son of God from all eternity, right? In whom, through whom, and for whom all things are made. And he comes down out of heaven. Let me suggest to you that the way we often think about grace, we think about the movements that are from on high and they coming down to us. We think of those things as being like icing on a cake or like a coat of snow, right, that covers the ground. This is not the way God comes to us, in fact. He comes from the inside out. In this case, the Creator becomes a creature, becomes one of us, right? Walks around and talks with us, right? I mean, this is Jesus who becomes a man. He is totally a man. You know, I often like to ask the kids in Sunday school, when I'm with a religious education, and I'm talking to them, you know, I like to say, you know, did Jesus exist before he was born? That's a trick question. The answer is yes and no. He existed as God, yes, from all eternity, but not as a man, because he was born. He was created in this respect, right? Did Jesus have two wills? Yes, a divine will and a human will. It's not as though his divine nature was like the soul that replaced the human soul, and now he's just sort of, as it were, you know, like the ghost of the machine, right? God sort of animating, you know, the human body. You know, no, Jesus Christ is totally and completely a human being. Even now that's the case. That's an extraordinary thing. Even now he's a man, like us in all things but sin. Just to bring all those things together. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing that he's done. For the rest of eternity, he will be like us in this respect. From the inside out, Jesus comes to us, is my point. Reveals the meaning of things. This is what he does when he reveals the purpose of water, right? In his baptism in the Jordan. He's revealing to us that this creation of his has a powerful effect when used in accord with his will. It's an extraordinary thing, right? That he blesses creation and then he makes it a scion of salvation for the rest of us. This is the gift that he shared with us and the gift that comes to us in the cross. This terrible event is actually the glory of God manifest, the love of the Father put forward for us to see and never forget. That as terrible as it is to look upon, at the same time it should give us hope, because to the ruddy end, the Father loves his creation, loves you, and he loves me, all the way to the end. Even when we have preferred everything to him, he will still take us back. When we have tried out every other possibility and only at the end say, well, I have nothing else to lose. I guess I'll go to God now. Even then he'll take our yes. Ours is not a proud God. He has stooped to conquer us. And this is what it looks like. So my prayer for you and for me as we move forward into this, rounding out this Lenten season and into the glory of the Easter season, is that our hearts, the interior spaces of our souls, would be stretched open, and that as we offer the Lord our intercessions, come to him this morning with the cares on our hearts the cares in our souls, the various things that we look at and we think, mount improbable, mount impossible. I just don't see how God is going to fix this. That we would come to him and we would look upon the cross and to see the greatness of his love, because surely that was our condition. Mount improbable, mount impossible. And yet God worked great things in our midst through his son, Jesus Christ. There is hope yet for the human family. Hope for you, hope for me. And it's that hope on this Sunday above all Sundays that we look to the Lord, praying for new life and life in abundance. Amen.